Hello, this is Professor Laird, and this is the video lecture for Chapter 9 Constitutions for the Intro to Politics class. Okay, as far as constitutions go, we're going to be looking at a general overview of constitutions in general, but we've already talked about our own constitution. I've assigned that for you to read, and we've looked through that. We've got the U.S. Constitution being one of the most influential documents in the entire world that inspired other constitutions, and it was the first of its kind. It was somewhat of a culmination of liberalism and Enlightenment thinking at that time. It sets up the structure for government and shows the rules for making the rules, I guess you could say. Got Article 1 looking at legislative powers, Article 2, executive powers, the president's branch, Article 3, judicial powers. Article 4 was the unity article that put the states together in order to recognize what one state has done for a person. If that person goes to another state, the other state should recognize that as well. Article 5, looking at the process for amendments. Article 6, the supremacy clause, that the national federal law will be the supreme law of the land, and then the process of getting it ratified. Constitutions, however, can't do it all. So they have to kind of set up the foundation or the framework. And comparatively speaking, the United States Constitution is pretty short and fairly vague, leaving a lot of room for interpretation and expansion. And even though it really hasn't been amended all that much, it leaves itself open to interpretation, because most constitutions since the U.S. Constitution have been considerably longer and more detailed. And when you look at state constitutions, incredibly long and incredibly detailed. The EU tried to write a constitution and it got so big that it just fell off the table, and they just kind of gave up on it. So with any constitution, however, you can't literally put everything in there. It wouldn't be practical to do that. So much is left to informal arrangements. The Supreme Court, that third branch of government, is therefore then used to interpret how that law is to be used in that particular case. And the president obviously takes the leading role in implementing the law, and then therefore has some discretion in order how to implement and enforce those laws that are passed by Congress. And then the Congress itself has its own bylaws as far as how to get its process done, such as things like the filibuster, which are not in the Constitution, but yet that was a procedure that the Congress approved back in the late 1800s that is now turning out to be potentially somewhat of a distraction to getting policy through the pipe there that might need to be looked at, but it's not in the Constitution. The constitutions vary in their formality. As I said before, older constitutions have fewer words. The Constitution originally in the United States was 4,300 words, with about more than half of that has been added to it. The newer ones have considerably more words. Even Germany's 1949 Constitution, coming out of World War II, they were under a lot of pressure to create a more democratic-leaning system after the fiasco of World War II. Considerably longer, comparatively speaking. But there is some virtue of this vagueness in order to give it some expansion, some interpretation. If it's too specific, it might be difficult to adapt to unforeseen circumstances. So that is, you could probably argue, has been one of the successes of the U.S. Constitution, that it had a room there to adapt to changing conditions, because the framers that wrote the Constitution in some cases probably would have never, ever imagined what we are dealing with today with respect to technology, population, complexity, all those things. So you had to have some element of adaptability. The example of how you could get specific and then perhaps regret it is the lame duck amendment. That was passed after President Roosevelt had been elected 4 times. No president ever before President Roosevelt had ever even run for more than two terms of office. It was just kind of an unsaid rule that 2 terms is enough. I'm out of here. But under Roosevelt, very extreme circumstances. First the Depression, and then World War II. And in each one of those cases, they did not want to change horses in midstream, so to speak. Roosevelt was unique in that he had a very congenial yet fatherly type of image that was apparently fairly useful in these times of turmoil, particularly with the Depression and then World War II. And then after that, the opposition party said, okay, well, let's just make it official that a president can only run for 2 terms. And then not long after they passed that, President Eisenhower, who was a very popular president, a Republican, could have actually run for a 3rd term. He wasn't near as old as some of our politicians are today, and he could have actually run again in 1960, and the Republicans, who were the ones that were pushing for this lame duck amendment, might have actually shot themselves in their own foot there by now restricting their own party president, who was fairly popular and could have potentially been elected for a 3rd term, but yet he was excluded from doing that because of this 22nd Amendment. Another one is Germany's Hitler-proofing it to where there's many, in order to try to restrict the type of candidates that can run. What that might have done is resulted in complications with the succession, because they certainly did not want to create another situation where somebody like Hitler could kind of slip in the back door and then get in control and then maintain control. Well, if you try to make that so restrictive, then you might have difficulty in trying to get a reasonable succession of leaders. So there's various examples out there where if you make it a little bit too specific, then you could hem yourself in. Now, as far as constitutional design, there's several long-standing traditions since the first ones were done. Is that, first of all, in the United States, it was trying to create a balance of representing the people, but at the same time having delegates to represent those people and have that diffusion from popular sentiment into the representatives who would then pass policy. So what you're trying to do is reflect the people's desires without necessarily having a pure democracy. So that seems to be fairly common, because almost all democracies in the world today are some form of representative republics. You also want to put a document out there that represents positive support for the state, that you want it to have the power to do things without too much power, and then you don't want to make it too much of a difficult transformation from one system to the next. Now, the United States had about a century's worth of English traditions to build upon, so it wasn't a dramatic transformation to go from the Articles of Confederation, which were passed fairly quickly during the Revolution, and then to the Constitution. But there have been some countries, such as Iraq, in recent examples, and even Russia, to where they're coming out of a system that's completely anti-democratic. And then if you're trying to make that much transformation in a fairly quick period of time, that could be difficult and might even increase the risk of it not succeeding. Another principle is its amendability. The general idea that started off day one with the framers of our Constitution, they did not want to make it easy to amend. They spent a lot of deliberation, and Madison put a lot of effort into kind of outlining this thing out that would be flexible and adaptable enough that you wouldn't have to just try to amend it every week. But even if you did want to significantly change something in that Constitution, you don't want them to be able to do it on a whim. You don't want to just say people are or woke up this morning and got tired of this, and so now let's change the Constitution. So the tendency is to make it fairly difficult to change, and with the United States, it is extremely difficult to change, and it is becoming even more difficult because you may recall when you read the Constitution that in order for an amendment to pass in the United States, both houses of Congress, the Senate and the House, have to pass that amendment by a 2/3 vote, both of them. And that is very difficult to do in today's climate. It's very difficult to get 2/3 of any legislative body to agree on anything. But not only that, once it comes out of Congress with 2/3 vote of both houses, which is very difficult, then it has to be confirmed and approved by 3/4 of all of the 50 states. So that's going to require about 38 states to confirm that as well. And since the Bill of Rights, which was literally a tack on to the Constitution, because the Bill of Rights was actually promised during the ratification process in order to get it ratified. So that was just a formality to go ahead and add those Bill of Rights, all 10 of them at one time. So therefore, technically, after that period, the United States Constitution has only been changed 17 times since then. The last amendment was back in the mid-90s, and that was actually an amendment that was originally proposed back in this original Bill of Rights, which originally had 12 amendments. 2 of them fell by the wayside. One of them was to not allow congressmen to give themselves a raise. The raise would not go into effect until after they got reelected. And that was added because it'd been on the books for so long. He just kind of got added as a formality in the mid-90s. But it's very difficult in today's climate to change anything in the Constitution because it would automatically be politicized as to what that change is about. The Supreme Court has actually assumed more of a role to interpret that. It may interpret along political lines as well, that we may be getting into some of that controversy now with the types of cases that the court chooses, and the majority of the court might be leaning this way or that way. It is controversial, but it does, as designed, provides that flexibility to interpret the law rather than to just change the Constitution. And those interpretations can actually change over time as the population shifts, public sentiment shifts, and then as the makeup of the Supreme Court shifts as well. Those, because we've seen just an example just recently, in 73, the court ruled that there was a right to an abortion based on the interpretation in the Constitution of the right to privacy. And then that was rescinded just recently, where the court ruled that there is not a constitutional right for an abortion. So that shows you how it can flip-flop 180 degrees through the court. But it's still, as designed, that gives it that flexibility. Now, this concept of incentive compatibility is perhaps a little confusing, but what the idea here is that you want to design a system where the office holders, the people that are running government, have some sort of incentive to do what society needs, balanced with personal rewards and punishment. So you could argue that, well, if a politician, they get paid a certain amount, no matter how great they are, or how wonderful policy they make, or how dramatically they change the world, they get the same old pay, right? Same amount. So therefore, you have to design it so that there is incentive for making improvements through public service, and that if you are given the choice that people could potentially choose for themselves, but, for example, if you want less tax for yourself, that could be less good for the United States. So the idea here is to design a system that you're representing not only your constituents from your state or from your district, but you're actually going to a body that is making up the entire country. So therefore, these delegates have to come to an agreement on something that's going to be good for the entire country, not necessarily just for you. So Congress, however, this is what is very hard to accomplish. This is why I said right up front, it's kind of a vague concept that, yeah, in principle, we want politicians to have incentive to pass policy that is good for the entire country because of the way this thing is designed. But they're also human beings, and congressmen, some congressmen may just pursue their own needs and feather their own nest, but congressmen may actually pursue the needs of their district rather than the United States as a whole. Now, that still has to be bargained for and hashed out in deliberations in Congress. So some compromise still may have to be met, even though a congressman may just be fairly district-centric, right? And rather than looking at the good of the entire country. So that's a paradox that we continuously have to deal with. The general idea is for politicians to come there and make the country a better place, but there's conflicting interests there, their own self-interest, the needs of their districts. Now let's talk about some types of systems. The federal system is a type of system that the United States of America is, where the states were already there. When we went for independence, we had our original 13 colonies. The Articles of Confederation set them up as a group of sovereign states. So therefore, we already had a federal system in place. When we fought the Revolution, the Constitution, therefore, when it was written, kept that in place. And as you may recall, when you read the Constitution, there were several places in there where the federal government specifically delegated things back to the states. These are the local authorities that we're talking about here. And the larger the country is, particularly square miles, not just population, but square miles, the federal system might be more practical that these large, diverse countries can break it up to where the federal government can delegate things to the states to do and then kind of provide an oversight or a general umbrella, or in fact, if it comes up to where the federal government has to rule on something or to pass law that is good for the entire country, well, then that's the supreme law of the land. Just like when the Supreme Court makes a ruling, that's the supreme ruling that all the other courts of all the other states have to comply with. However, if that doesn't happen, then the states are still left up to take care of their own business. That's why they're delegated to handle their own criminal processes, their own voting systems, things like that, their own education systems, their own taxation powers, and even their own eminent domain where they can decide to take property for their public good. So there's lots of things that are delegated down to the states. So that's the big question. How much power is distributed to the states, or in some cases they're called provinces, called states in the United States. However, when you look at international relations terminology, countries of the world are typically called states. And then they may have breakups and within, such as Russia, have a breakup of territory that some places are called provinces. Interestingly enough, a lot of the conflict, and I'm not talking about war, but I'm talking about political conflict or jurisdictional conflict or power sharing conflict, a lot of that is between the central government and these local groups. The United States has had a long history in our federalist system where states are pushing back against the federal government, or the federal government may be pushing back on the states. Whatever the climate is, it can go one way or the other. During the Depression, the federal government exerted more and more authority over the states in order to try to alleviate the Depression. And then, particularly as we come out of the 60s, when a lot of the courts were making rulings that were kind of locking in the Bill of Rights through the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause. As we were coming out of the 60s, there was a pushback from the states that the government's getting a little bit too intrusive. So now we may be in that era where the states are exerting more power than they had before. 21 state, and I want to say states here, I'm talking about countries, right? So 21 countries in the world, which is about 11% of the total countries in the world, are federal systems. Now, that may not sound like a lot, but however, that's comprised of some of the biggest states in the world. So that is 39% of the world's population and 50% of the world's land area. So that shows you how prominent these federal systems are as far as territory and population, because the biggest countries in the world are the ones that typically use the federal systems. And here's a map here that shows the countries of the world, and you can see there's big states here, populated states here, that are federal systems that are around the world. Russia, for example, breaks it up into what they call okrugs or oblasts. That's their term for provinces. There is quite an assortment of break up into provinces here into Russia that you can go through and look through that. And some of them you may have never even heard of. One that seems to get some press is Chechnya, a very small little province there in that finger down there in Russia. Oh, speaking of Chechnya, I knew there was a reason why I was going to mention it. Fairly small but controversial territory because of its Islamic Muslim tendencies there. There's even a little bit of pushback from Chechnya on the Ukrainian war, because the president of Chechnya was originally supportive of the war, and now because of the uptick in war and the request for more recruits, might be starting to see a little bit of pushback on there. Also, the Boston Marathon bombers, their family was from Chechnya, and the older brother had actually gone back to Chechnya, where they figured that that's where he got radicalized and came back, influenced his little brother, and did that bombing there. So that's what, and there was a civil war very briefly there in the 90s between Russia and Chechnya. So there's been a long history of that little state there. Now, unitary systems are the ones where the entire country is one centralized unit. So political power is typically more centralized in these unitary systems, such as Sweden is an example of a unitary system where the central federal government controls the whole territory. There are cities, but there may be some local entities, but it's not broken up into states like the United States is, where the federal government delegates that power to. No, it's all centrally located, and this is also a factor of what they decided in their original constitutional choice there. And obviously for practical reasons as well, because the smaller in area the country is, the less likely it may feel to need that break up into a federal system. So the exceptions, of course, is that Sweden, even though it's a unitary system, it draws only 64% of government revenue. So that is somewhat unique in that Sweden lets a lot of these local entities, the towns and the villages, collect a fairly sizable portion of the tax revenue. Whereas in America, a lot of that tax revenue is collected by the federal government and then distributed back to the states. Those are some, everybody's a little bit different, so that's what we're talking about here in general. This is what I'm getting at with the United States federal government. Collects about 60% of all tax revenue, which is really not that different from Sweden, but it transfers approximately 9% of that back to state and local governments. So here is the federal's share of it, and then the back to states is that much. States collect about 18% of their own revenue, and then the states pass about 9% of that back down to the counties and cities, and then the local cities collect about 13% of the total slice there. And then a very small portion of the federal revenue goes all the way down to the cities, such as New York City does get some federal assistance as well. So that's a breakdown of how that revenue is transferred back. Now, again, there's no right or wrong answers here between federal and unitary. A lot of it is just a kind of a practical decision. But too much decentralization could lead to uncoordinated policies and confusion. And we have seen some of that in the United States when the states that are pushing back against federal government may not want to comply with what other states are doing that are complying with the federal government. We are seeing a lot of fractured policies with respect to gun control, with respect to legalization of marijuana, and now we're seeing that fracturing up along political lines with respect to bans on abortion. So you're getting a more and more fractured system over some of these policies that could potentially be problematic until or if the United States federal government decides to come in and says, okay, now we're just going to make it a law for the entire country to follow this particular path. Now, on the other side of that, too much centralization could lead to some inflexible policies that local entities might feel the need to be more flexible. How can one policy for a country this huge, how can one size fits all work for a country that is so big as the United States with such a large, diverse population? So that's what they would argue back on that. And then if the government feels like that it may need to amass a little bit more central power, then that could push popular sentiment or public opinion against federal government. And we're probably seeing that today whenever the federal government decides to come down on a policy and say, okay, we need a federal policy on that. Well, all the states that disagree with the government already are going to go, whoa, I don't want the federal government telling me what to do. So those are some issues that we've got to deal with in a federal system where there may be some need for centralization, but it could backfire on you. The industrialized states, in other words, the developed countries of the world, most of whom are democracies, they are converging somewhat on similar degrees of centralization, particularly with respect to national defense and the economy. There are certain things, certain policies that there seem to be practical degrees of centralization from one industrialized country to the next, and that particularly if they want to cooperate with each other and trade with each other or invest in each other, there are some commonalities there. But a lot of these social issues that might be kind of special to that particular country, whether it's even anti-immigration sentiment or some of these things that we've talked about with respect to abortion or assisted suicide or gun control, yeah, there could be still some fracturing going up on that, but still some centralization. Because with respect to constitutions, most do have some form of Bill of Rights. The framers of the Constitution did not put that in there at first because they figured the states would have their own Bill of Rights. However, the Anti-Federalists started pushing back against that, saying, wait a minute, what's going to keep you from abusing our rights? So therefore, the Bill of Rights at the national level was promised immediately, and that helped in the ratification process. But the states still have their own Bill of Rights. The rule of law is meant not to be applied arbitrarily. That's what I talked about earlier when we looked at that effective dispensing of justice in that last chapter that we talked about before the test. It's meant to be applied equally. So therefore, the Constitution sets that in stone. Here's the rule of law. Now, obviously, it can be interpreted various ways, but the intent there is that this is the rule of law, and we're not just going to change the rule of law every time somebody else gets elected. Here's the rule of law. Here's what we're basing it on. Yes, then it could be administered or interpreted somewhat differently as we go from administration to administration. This concept of constitutionalism, it gets a lot of debate, is that how faithful do you want to adhere to what we think the original constitutionalists had in mind? So therefore, it's kind of, and this is also particularly along political lines as well, whereas the originalists might tend to be more towards the conservative side of politics, whereas the evolutionists may be more on the liberal side of politics. The originalists have sometimes taken it to an extreme and says, well, the original framers of the Constitution did not have women voting. And so therefore, well, does that mean that women shouldn't vote because they couldn't vote when the original thing was written? Well, I don't know that we would want to go that far, but yet some originalists may be wanting to go back to, if not that far, perhaps as far as they can possibly go back to it, to interpret that Constitution from the original point of view, when in reality it has kind of adapted to the changing conditions of economy. Now, as far as our Bill of Rights go, what I want you to do is read the Bill of Rights. It's very short. It probably would take you maybe 15 minutes to read the entire Bill of Rights. The First Amendment talks about the basic freedoms of religion, speech, press, assembly, the right to petition. Second Amendment, right to bear arms. That one's fairly controversial because the gun control or the gun rights crowds would try to interpret that to suit their needs. The Fourth Amendment, no unreasonable searches and seizures. You have to have a warrant. Fifth Amendment is also a big one. Talks about due process, right to remain silent, eminent domain, where can't take property without fair compensation. And then the Sixth Amendment is also another big one that gives you the right to a speedy public trial by a jury, also with the right to have counsel. And the Eighth Amendment is the right to have bail, no cruel or unusual punishment. And the 10th Amendment is the one that the states were really waiting for. That's the one that says anything that's not in the Constitution that is specifically delegated for the federal government, it's therefore everything else is reserved to the states. And that primarily includes criminal codes as well as some of their home rule type situations where they can set up their own jurisdictions the way they want, as well as the concurrent powers that the state has the right to tax people for their own business, the right to their own eminent domain. So those are called the concurrent powers. Those are the three main categories that are delegated down. So the discussion forum, in lieu of having the classroom lecture, we'll watch this video, read the Bill of Rights, and let's brainstorm it. We see what the Constitution has in our Bill of Rights, but the world has changed quite a bit. It's a lot bigger, a lot more complex, a lot more technological advancement, that there might be some rights that might be worth adding to the Constitution after all this time. So this is your assignment to brainstorm that, and in a couple of sentences or so, what might be an additional right or called liberty, protection, guarantee that you would consider adding to our current Bill of Rights. What might be a new one that might be worth adding in today's world? So that's going to be the discussion forum. Looking at Great Britain, that one is been evolved through precedent of rulings, because the Great Britain, interestingly enough, which was our forerunners, our model, so to speak, they had no written constitution. And perhaps that might have motivated the framers to have one because of what they came from or what their descendants or ancestors came from. That it became more of a rather through statute and court precedent and standard practice. So it served them fairly well with their type of system, that these statutes that were set in place for a long time and the court precedents have served them fairly well as their rule of law. Their individual rights obviously evolved over centuries of court decisions. They had even a century head start ahead of us. It's unlikely to be imitated because of the complexity of the world today, with states trying to get their act together. To piecemeal it like Great Britain did probably would be very difficult. They would need some sort of foundational rule of law to set the procedures in stone that they could then build from there and then try to develop that democratic political culture. So the entry to EU was a major change because therefore Great Britain now had to kind of comply, kind of like what Virginia and New York had to do with the Constitution. There was another layer of federal government that they had to comply with. England was never happy about that, being the empire that they were for so long. Now they're a member of EU, which is then now trying to tell them the rules that they need to follow to comply with this European Union thing that they want to build, that may originally have had some goals of being the United States of Europe, perhaps. They're still a long way from that. But it's also a factor that led to their Brexit, that they were never fairly happy or comfortable with it. And so there, when the anti-immigration sentiment started to build, when the popular sentiment started to catch hold, is, hey, you know what, we can actually get out of this and be back to our own autonomous self. Well, now that they've done it, there's probably some growing sentiment that maybe it wasn't worth exiting from the EU when you look at the benefits they could get from being a member of that union there. Now, there is a declining influence of the United States Constitution. It was the model to go by for a long time. But as we get into the 80s and our polarization starts to form, our own difficulties with our own politics, before that, 160 of the 170 countries that had constitutions had modeled theirs after the United States. So that's a pretty big example that the United States Constitution has set over a long period of time. However, since that time, things have shifted kind of the other direction, to where more and more countries are not using the United States as a model. We've been having some of our problems internally with our lack of productivity of our Congress, our politicization of the court. Also, one thing that the Constitution doesn't do, and that's kind of at the heart of our exercise here, the United States really doesn't guarantee a whole lot of human rights or protections. So therefore, these countries that are coming into the world over the last few decades are dealing with a lot more issues. So therefore, they feel like that maybe our Constitution should guarantee more rights or more protections or more liberties than the U.S. Constitution did. So that kind of plays into the exercise there. Well, what in the United States might be something that could potentially be added, where these other countries are already adding them to their constitutions. And then the commitment to originalism, or the trying to go back and interpret the Constitution back to the way it was written in that day, that could be off-putting to many new nations who want to address the world as it is today. And then, of course, when the U.S. Supreme Court gets more and more conservative and starts kind of interpreting the Constitution more and more back to the way it may have originally been looked at, that could also be off-putting to new countries that would perhaps go a different route in their Constitution. Another thing is the waning influence of that U.S. power, whereas prior to the end of the Cold War, the United States was the model of democracy. We were trying to kind of set an example for all the countries in the world that did not want to be communist. We had a certain amount of prestige, obviously the largest economy in the entire world, but the waning influence of those things, as well as a more politically driven Supreme Court, those could be having an effect. The United States Constitution might actually be too difficult to amend, and the more polarized we get, the less and less likely that we would be able to amend it. So other countries are saying, well, we don't want to get into that stumbling block. And then the U.S. Constitution may certainly be out of step with the needs of other countries. And that's part of that declining influence of the United States, that because we have gone our own way in our influence in trying to get other countries to go and follow our example, that may be somewhat in decline as well. So therefore, the Constitution may not be as attractive nowadays as it was. All right, so that wraps up Chapter 9. Stay tuned for the discussion forum. We will meet back on Blackboard Collaborate next week. This is the substitute for class this week. So have a good weekend, and I will see you in class on Blackboard Collaborate next week.